meeting tonight. I'd like to thank everyone for being here. If we'd like to start with a invocation or thought from Commissioner Gardner and Commissioner Webb, if you could lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
You bet. Okay, I'm going to have an invocation. Our dear Father in heaven, we bow before thee at the beginning of this Planning Commission meeting, and we ask that thy guidance and thoughts go with us this evening as we discuss these items. Father, we are thankful for this community in which we live, and we ask thee to watch over the residents and watch over us as we discuss and plan things for the city. And these things we pray for in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. So for the roll call, it looks like we have all of the commissioners with us tonight, except for Commissioner Neighbor, who is excused, and Commissioner Bailey, who might be running a few minutes late. So let's start with the consideration and action to approve the February 19th, 2025 Planning Commission meeting minutes. Did everyone have a chance to review those?
I did. I do have a question. The bulk of this meeting was really focused on giving City Council a recommendation in reference to the communication towers. The concern I have is coming down into the consideration action. It's like it's B, page 6-ish, but it says that Chair Nancaro made a motion to amend the North Ogden Code Title 11-17 wireless telecommunication with proposed changes to the text as discussed by planning commissioners and staff and forwarded recommendation to the City Council, and that I second. My concern here is, if I'm not mistaken, I believe that what the motion was specifically to have both the stealth changes and also the oh gosh, I have this written down. Hold on. Stealth changes, and should have had this pulled up here.
It's towers in residential areas.
Yeah, so here we go. The mature landscaping in the stealth mode, that the recommendation was that they would remain with Planning Commission and that we would be recommending a 10-foot setback. And my only concern here is that for the sake of City Council, I don't know that this gives them the summary of what our intentions were. And if you read it, it's quite weaving the text prior to this. If I read this not having been at the meeting or watched the meeting, I don't know that I would understand what our recommendation was. So that would be my concern, and I believe your words were listing those three things out. Does anyone else have memory of this, or?
That's a great comment, and we can ask the recorder's office to revise that, given the notes that we took during the meeting, so that it's reflective.
Okay.
And we've heard from that applicant that they are not planning to move forward until the meeting on the 25th. So the minutes, the amended minutes won't. Well, I don't know. Can they approve those minutes with?
So you could approve those with the amendments, or we could wait till the 19th with the new language and do it then.
You could wait till the 19th, because that would still give time for me to include the link to the minutes of the meeting that has then been updated to the council the following Tuesday. That makes sense. So either way I'm comfortable with, but we will make sure that that note gets back to the recorder's office to make the motion more clear on specifically what you did.
Yeah, and it was kind of a rambling motion.
Right.
You know, we were sort of like trying to encapsulate a number of amendments, I guess.
Yeah, and just to recap for the sake of the recorder, the what's written here at 1:14:31 and the timestamp is almost accurate, but it's missing that the mature landscape approvals and the stealth mode approvals, the recommendation was that Planning Commission would still see those, and that ultimately we would recommend a 10-foot setback, just to clarify. That will just help, I think, City Council with our intentions.
So we will table that for now. That's the. Table it for now and take another look at it.
Yeah, you'd take a motion to postpone the decision.
Until next.
So
Planning
somebody need to
Commission
make
meeting.
that motion to postpone.
I'll make a motion to postpone the approval of the February 19th, 2025 Planning Commission minutes until, what was the date?
Following meeting.
Following meeting.
And I second that.
Oh, can I take a voice vote on this one? Yeah. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That will be postponed. Are there any ex parte communications or conflicts of interest to disclose? Nothing on the agenda tonight. We don't have any members of the public in the room. Is there anybody online, John?
Nope.
So I'm gonna forego reading the whole script. then.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and move on to legislative item number 5, zone text amendment 2025-02. Discussion and work session regarding a legislative amendment to consider amending North Ogden Code Title 11 in a wide variety of sections and subsections to correct references and clean up the land use code. The presenter tonight is Scott Hess.
Thank you very much, Chair and Planning Commission. So I want to say Ryan, honestly, as we've used this code, Ryan has been logging these for the last year and a half or so. I had a crude piece of paper that had several sticky notes on it, and Ryan was kind enough to move that to an electronic format that made this possible. So thank you very much, Mr. Nunn. But we tried in earnest when the code went through to find all of these missing references or incorrect references. And one of the big issues that we had was that kind of late in the game, there were a few chapters that got just cut and pasted and pulled out. And so we missed them. And if you think of the code, it's sort of a choose your own adventure in some cases. So you have a section of the code that you're in, and it may relate to another section of the code. And so having those circular references be correct is really critical for the public's sake and public's use of the code, and also our own. I know this was kind of a long document. We tried to make it as easy as possible with the direct links to what we were talking about into our code, and to familiarize yourself with the code instead of just say, here, open up northogdencity.gov, navigate to land use code, and then pick through it and find it. So you weren't required to basically go through everything. That's a recommendation someday when you have time, is maybe to just utilize the code, or find out, if I were to build a secondary driveway on my property, what are the rules and regulations? That would be a great question for you to try to answer as a resident, but also as on the Planning Commission, understanding how Title 11 works. The way that our city recorder likes to do code amendments is that when you have a removal of the code, it's just a simple strike through. And when you're adding language, it's red. But what we noticed is that there are two more substantive types of changes in this list of 36. So the yellow are items that we want to have a conversation with the Planning Commission about. And then the blue highlighted areas are areas that will actually, when we do the public hearing notice posting, we'll probably pull those out entirely and post a public hearing notice specifically on, say, swimming pools or animal and fowl and the effects there. And that way it'll simplify for the city council and the Planning Commission next time, but for those changes that are really just administrative code updates and corrections that can almost be consent agenda items, really simplistic, versus weighing proximity locations of certain items, or like how we have with accessory building standards. We just don't want this to have any feeling or air of rolling big changes into a whole big list of stuff that just kind of pushed through a code amendment that may have wanted or warranted a bigger conversation. For tonight, we're looking at this simply as a work session, so feel free to ask questions. We'll go through these. We'll probably point out a couple of these items. I don't want to go through all 36 specifically, so this is sort of a, questions and answers, and we want to be responsive to you. And what we're looking for are recommendations really on the yellow and blue items on your feelings, so that when we bring this back, we've got an idea of what the Planning Commission is thinking now. And if you need more time after this meeting or you think about it, please shoot us an email. We are planning on posting public hearing notice this Friday, which would put this on the following meeting on the 19th of this month. That doesn't mean with something this large, you have to make your decision that night, but that would be when the formal public hearing would be noticed and opportunity given to the public. We also wanted to sort of slow this one down, also because almost every one of these code changes are what we would consider at large or citywide, which changes the state's requirement for how we notice them. So if it were a change specific to any one individual property, then we would mail within 300 feet of that property owner's property a specific letter coming in, like a zone change or a zoning text, or a zone change or a general plan amendment gets these physical mail notices. But when you change the entirety of Title 11 or make 35 minor changes that you can't pinpoint any individual property owner, there really is no larger overall notice. So the notice at this point is the fact that it will have been on planning or on Facebook several times, on the city's website, on the Utah Public Meeting Notice website, and has been noticed as public meetings, work session items, then a formal public hearing. But for the most part, I think a lot of this is innocuous. It's just us that needing to do code cleanup. And we wanted enough of it that we bring it forward to you in a meaningful way instead of do this like 36 times, every meeting we're dealing with one of them. So we've sort of just put up with the code as it is. And now we're here to go over it with you. So I will run through this really quickly, and feel free to basically just stop me at any point and ask questions. Starting with 11.2.15 minor subdivisions. What we're doing is we're adding the bullet point A and saying, hey, we have this section of the code for minor subdivisions, which outlines all of the rules and regulations. Go look at it. And that's the C1125 minor subdivisions development standards. And then B currently is where A starts. And this one was my own confusion of thinking originally. I had this panic moment of, we eliminated everything that was important to minor subdivisions, which is that it's fewer than 10 lots, does not designate any new right-of-way, and is administratively approved through its own process that doesn't come to Planning Commission. Well, all those standards exist in 11.25. We just forgot to put the, please go here section in 11.2, which 11.2 is our overall procedures for how we do several types of land use decisions. In the definitions, building height, there are some images, and one we use on an uphill lot, the top back of the curb as the location where you begin the height measurement from. So it's like if you're standing at the street on the top back of the curb, a house can be 35 feet tall, but as it moves up and down in space or in space up a lot, up a hill, the total height can be 40 feet. And nowhere on the drawing does it indicate that we utilize the top back of curb. So it's referenced but not shown, and it's an outdated drawing. So we're going to clean the drawings up so that everybody, building department, planning department, is, under the same understanding of how we're measuring these things. So
Scott?
Yeah.
What if a street doesn't have a curb?
Yeah, that's a great point. We would probably use edge of asphalt at that point. I mean, there's several judgment calls, and I wish I could pull up the 3 dimensions of a lot that exists over in the Lakeview subdivision. That's Frog Rock area, right? There's a lot that is on a corner And across one direction, I bet it loses 35 or more feet of elevation. And in another direction, it gains like 30 feet of elevation. So it's an uphill and downhill lot. And to stick a house on that and determine where we measured from was more art than science. And basically the building department and the planning department got together with the homeowner and we chose a point along the curb and we said, this is where we will measure your house from. So we know it's like, it's non-compliant in several ways, but it's consistently non-compliant. And you couldn't have moved the house around any direction that would have forced it into compliance. But we measured it the way we would measure any. And what we did is we chose the point of the curb directly across from the front door. And that became how we measured the height of the house. So some of these become judgment calls because the world isn't flat and North Ogden is excessively unflat. So that's a great question.
I have, I have a question about that too.
Yeah.
I mean, no lot's flat.
Mhm.
So what determines top of back of curb?
Is it the center of the lot?
I usually use the location directly across from the front door because I measure a house height to finished floor elevation, meaning that you can show a little like an approach and some steps and stuff. So typically when I measure the 35 feet, it's from the threshold of the front door walking into the house. And then that house might sit up, down, indifferent a little bit depending on the lot to have some basement windows that show, but that's the point of reference that I use to measure a house height. And then we usually use that front door as directly across from the curb as the elevation. And we have an elevation certificate given to us on each lot, and at least it has the elevation lines. So we can pinpoint, all right, you're at 5550 here, and your house is at 5590 or 5555 at the front line of the elevation, I'm sorry, foundation, and then it's 35 feet tall. Like we just make sure that math all kind of works.
Okay.
And before my time, it's been told to me that there was a house constructed where we did make them tear off a truss package. They built the house too tall. So we rarely go out like with the tape measure and make sure, especially on 35-foot tall ones, but if it's questionably tall, our building official, Nate Davis, is not opposed to or afraid of climbing up on a roof and dropping a plumb bob and measuring the height. And we have required people to come back into compliance.
And that's 35 feet to the subfloor, more or less.
Yeah, 35 feet to the subfloor where your front door threshold is. Yep. And that again, if you think about it, that allows garages to kind of move up and down in space to navigate the steepness of a driveway. So we don't typically use the garage either. If you read our code in the very strictest sense, it's essentially anywhere that there is an exposed foundation, which means we have measured the full garage, and sometimes garages are lower. And then you have like 4 or 5 steps going into the house from the garage. And that helps flatten the driveway down so they don't have to have the driveway as a ski slope to get the garage pushed up at the same elevation as the house. And we've gone back and forth on that. So it's, we do a little bit of both. Sometimes we measure it. We try to just measure it in the strictest sense, right? And then if there's an interpretation to be made, it's given kind of the planning director. And an example of a substantive code change would be if the planning commission felt like 35 feet is too restrictive and we just should have had taller houses in North Ogden, then we could open that whole thing up. But all we're trying to do here is make sure that the drawing is clear in how we've been administering stuff for years and years and years as a planning and building department. And Ryan? go
Yeah,
ahead.
I wanted to add, yeah, I think we could get into like a better, maybe this could be a later, more in-depth code correction. I think what Scott is saying, which is what we're trying to do is currently those pictures and the text are mismatched.
Mm.
So you have the picture for the uphill, but next to it is the downhill code. And so you have to read it, but then go find the image. And that's what this This
Sort
is
of
like a
cleanup.
quick, it's a cleanup of,
Mhm.
hey, let's move. And like Scott said, we kind of want to update the image too. So we'll bring it in and, but I think it's come up often enough. It could, we could look at a more substantive, code change.
Yeah.
On how do we measure these uphill? It's come up more often with uphill lots because it is top back of curb, which is difficult.
Yeah.
Difficult to, hey, where from top
Yeah.
back of curb?
In a lot of jurisdictions that I've permitted in, they do an average
Right.
grade.
Yep, and we've had to deal with that when you have a side grade across the home, and so then we pick a point, or we do like the lowest and the highest, and then that gives us an average grade to measure the height of the house. We have done that as well. But the way Rob Scott, so my predecessor, Rob Scott, the way he administered it was different than how I administered it, is different than how Craig, the predecessor of Rob, administered it. And then you have, luckily in our building department, Gary's been there 30 million years and 30 plus years. He retired, and then he came back and he's a plans inspector for us still. And so he's been administering it certain ways very consistently for a long time. And then Nate Davis administers it similar to how Gary and Bruce were. So we just all want to get on the same page on how we administer it, because like most things in life, when you're administering these codes, like there's inaccuracies, but if we're consistently inaccurate, and then we're, that's the most correct we can be. Because it really is, there's several of these are like, it is an art, not a science. And you want to believe that like the lot is flat and the world is flat and top back of curb always matters and it's 35 feet tall for the house, but it gets really weird really fast, or it can. But we work with, we're really good at, I feel like, working with people. Otherwise you would have droves of angry residents in here trying to change the code all the time. But just recently on a house that we used an averaging for the house height. We made them pull a roof. We made them lower one section of the roof to be basically even with all the other sections of the roof. So we had an agreed upon total house height, and they had one section of roof that exceeded it as an architectural feature. And we required them to pull it down because it exceeded it by several feet. And we just couldn't justify having anywhere on the house taller than that, given that we had already kind of been pushed on the administration of the definition. And as an architect, maybe that makes your heart break, but we made him redraw it a little bit.
I'm not that kind of architect to add a bunch of fluff,
I was gonna say, I think we have probably a $50 prize for anyone who could correctly identify all the definition of building heights in a way that works across the whole city. Unless you just say, oh, you can build 100 feet. That doesn't count. Like if you're using 35 feet, that starting point
Yeah.
is so problematic. That house I showed you just a few seconds ago that was up on here, like it doesn't meet
How about-
anything except for that, what Scott said, that front door, it meets that 35 feet, but that it moves so quick that you lose that 35 feet so quick.
John, is Mountain Road in 3100. There's the tall house with the flat roof, but then up Mason Cove, there's an uphill rear lot. And from the front, the house is a rambler. Like you would have no idea, but it has
You go around
cool
behind.
sub basements. It hangs way off the hill. And it even exceeds the 55-foot height maximum for a downhill lot, because that lot continues to come downhill. So it depends on at what point up the curb you measure the 55 feet from. And on the front of the house, it's a very reasonable rambler. It's not like they tried to sneak in a really tall house. It was just a matter of a difficult lot to administer. And there's certain reasons that there are still lots available in these subdivisions. Over by Frog Rock is a good example. There's several lots over there that are just, I think, hard to physically place a house on. So those lots have been open for 20 years. Here's when we redid the code, we made an attempt to make things as consistent as possible. But John, if you go to number 4, it's 11-9A2L home occupations. And if you'll click on the link for 9A2, And this should take you to public. That one just takes you to the whole code, but what we're looking at is, go down to P, public buildings, public park recreation grounds and associated buildings. And then R is public utility substation. That all seems fine. But now if you'll go back to the staff report and go down to number 8 and click on 11.9 FM permitted uses. This one indicates, and this is within the multifamily R4 zone, that public schools, private educational institutions, having a curriculum similar to that ordinarily given in public schools, and then public utility substations. So there's a difference in public schools versus public buildings, public park recreation grounds, and associated buildings. And we've noticed this inconsistency across several zones. And maybe there were reasons at the time of code creation that public schools were excluded from certain zones, but given in other zones. But one thing is that the state legislature has stripped away the city's ability to tell a school where they can locate. So essentially, we could make the code silent entirely on public schools, and they could put a school smack dab in the middle of our commercial zone. Like that happened in South Weber City. The charter school next to Maverick on South Weber Drive is in a formerly commercially zoned piece of property, and schools have that power from the state. But there are inconsistencies, and the further Ryan and I went into this, and it was really Ryan, like we realized that in the permitted uses themselves, there's 10 lists of them, and there are a lot of inconsistencies between them. So we are going to try to right size that and bring you back, like, this is the list of permitted uses, which does ebb and flow and change depending on if you're residential, multifamily, commercial, or manufacturing. But the areas where the touch points are the same, like public utility substations, public schools, public buildings, we'd like to have one agreed upon. This is the thing that encapsulates all of that stuff. And we'll think about reasons why it should or shouldn't come to you that way. But that's what that any of those yellows where it says where there are inconsistencies with between permitted uses within various zones, that's what we're talking about. The next one down, number 9, 11.9G3 site development standards. This is specifically within the Roy Lance Farms Phase 2 planned unit development zone. And what's missing in the site development standards is that the front yard setback in some zones, we specifically write in there is required to be 37 feet, or the lot width is required to be 37 feet. And then what we say is at the 30-foot setback. And the reason for that is if you think about a cul-de-sac, the frontage of a cul-de-sac shrinks like a pie shape as it gets closer to the curb. So as you get closer to the right of way, the frontage reduces. But what we do is we require them to meet their front yard setback at the front lot width at the front yard setback. So cul-de-sac lots are only 100 feet wide at 30 feet back, and then they get smaller and smaller and smaller as it comes down. And that allows cul-de-sacs to not end up being these like huge pie-shaped lots. Because if they have to meet it at the right-of-way line, that's really difficult to do. This is one where Roy Lance Farms is an existing subdivision that was probably there when I was born. I mean, it's been there for a long time. It's on 1900 North. As you go 1900 Northwest off of Washington Boulevard and swing down through, that's the Roy Lance Farms subdivision. I don't think there are any open lots left. So this would not affect anything other than somebody trying to subdivide one of their lots into a smaller width lot. But again, it's an inconsistency in how the code is written, because all other code sections indicate that the frontage is a calculation of the width at the front setback line. And so we'd like to be consistent. Questions? I know that's like all super technical and specific. Okay.
This one is 20 feet back rather than 30 feet back because it's a
planned unit,
Small.
yep, a PUD. So at the time that Roy Lance Farms was created, there was a development agreement. And that would have been part of the legislative process of developing the PUD at the time. Quail Ponds is another one that's
gonna
more
say
recent
Quail
history that has reduced side yard setbacks, reduced front yard setbacks. They limited their own house heights to 27.5 feet or something like that in order to do like 1.5 story houses, but they didn't, like, part of the selling point of that subdivision was that we're not going to have houses that block your view of Ben Lomond because all the houses are shorter. And that's all totally plausible and possible when you go through a specific zoning text amendment to create a zone. So Roylands Farms, Quail Ponds, and all of our other PUDs, Patriot Point, the MPC zones for Cooperstown, not Patriot Point, Village at Prominence Point, those all have very specific site-specific standards that we have to follow, and we go back into the code to find them. Same thing. So the next one, number 10, has the minimum lot width, not saying measured 30 feet back from the front property line. It has incorrect references to the accessory buildings and incorrect references to public buildings. So we are adding and correcting those. Again, very limited. It's just limited impact because Roylands Farms and Quail Ponds are both completely built out, but that doesn't mean we don't want the code to be clean. The accessory building standards is one that was messy in several locations. So 11.9M8 is a recurring update here. And as we go down through, getting to the first substantive change, number 15, 11.9M accessory dwelling units, D in zones. We're wondering, should the accessory dwelling units code need to include all residential zones? So if we get into 11.9M, which I don't think I didn't do that's my fault that I didn't do a link. I'm sorry. This 11.9M9 accessory dwelling units code, and down in D, the zones which you can currently do a detached accessory dwelling unit are RE20, R18, R18AG, R110, R112.5, and RCC zones. No accessory dwelling unit may be allowed in any multifamily dwelling. This is wrong in two ways. One is that the state code, again, has preempted cities and said attached ADUs, attached mother-in-law apartments, basement apartments, over the garage apartments when it's attached to your main house are permitted in all zones, just carte blanche. So one, we can't restrict that at all. But this is a conversation, and we'll probably we may mail residents in, I don't know how we'll notify actually, but this is one that will affect several zones. Is if you read this specifically, the hillside protection zones, which is like areas of the Cove, for instance, you can't get a detached ADU in. And I know we've permitted them because there are pool houses that are essentially, as big as my house in some cases, but there's pool houses that operate as accessory dwelling units up in the Cove that technically, by the way the code is written, are not permitted. So I think that we have missing references to all of the residential zones, and I'm certainly okay. I don't believe the state has us obligated to require an ADU in a multi-tenant building, but it comes down to the structure at that point. Like if you had a single family house in a commercial zone, but it's always been a single family house, I would be hesitant to not permit them to build an ADU because I think that's a lawsuit waiting to happen and one the city might not.
Because it's
win.
an ongoing use.
Because it's an ongoing
yeah.
use. And so in that case, the use trumps the zoning. Because that zoning could be anything, but the ongoing persistent use of that home as a single family home is the important part. So maybe that needs to say, be changed to say, and existing single family homes in all other zones or something along those lines, just to, belt and suspenders, be clear that any future person administering the code reads that, yep, you're a single family home, but you happen to be in the R4 code area, which there are several of those in our city. In fact, every single family home north of Pleasant View Drive on the west side of Washington Boulevard, from Pleasant View all the way up to Alberta. On the west side is R4. There are several of those that are multifamily R4, and they exist as single-family homes, but that's a future like buyout and multifamily space.
So Scott, did you say that the state said that ADUs could be in any zone?
In any 80, yep, every single family home is permitted one attached ADU,
Single family home.
any single family home. Yep.
Okay.
So if it's already a duplex, there's no obligation. So if it was constructed as a side-by-side duplex, we're not obligated to permit them to do a basement dwelling, but we could opt into it if we wanted to. We could allow it, but right now, if you're in the R2, R3, or R4 zone and you are a duplex, a townhome, or some other form of multifamily, we don't currently permit you to get an ADU.
Okay.
And over time, maybe that's something that changes. Like we have a few areas of the city with some pretty large townhomes that have garages plus driveways. And those might be areas where somebody might want to create a basement ADU because their now adult children can't afford a home or a townhome or to live anywhere. Like that's probably something that will change over time. But that's my understanding of state code, is that it's not an obligation in multifamily structures.
So it's not residential zones, it's only single family.
Yep.
Residential.
Right.
Okay.
Scott, with this is, I mean, clearly there's a trend here. Is it more, do you foresee more of an issue with a lot of people living in a small space, or a bigger issue with a lot of cars in a place that's not designed to have that many cars?
How can I answer this in a non-political way? There are already small homes with small driveways that have a lot of people in them of driving age. So they
Mhm.
overflow with cars.
Yep.
So that's it's a value judgment in some cases, because I don't care if there's already large families, and I'll pick on my own neighborhood. Like I can throw a rock from my house to two different houses that have 9 kids. And I know that they don't have 9 parking spaces in either of those homes. And those kids are getting dang near to driving age as we watch more and more cars populate the street. So I would say parking is a huge issue for the neighbors. Less so in long-term rentals than in like short-term rentals, like an Airbnb. Parking tends to become like one of the number one issues. Like all these cars are blocking our streets, become a party house. But once somebody actually lives there, they put up with the fact that the teenager's car lives on the street because there just isn't room on the driveway. So it's concerning both ways, really, like in its own factor.
And it ends up being a bigger problem on non-standard streets,
Uh-huh.
right? To Scott's point about, 9 or, what is it, 8 months of the year, we're okay with parking on the street. It's the snow falls. But one of my favorite experiences in planning commission, none of you were on the planning commission at the time, was a group home was coming in, and this person got up and said, "This is a single family neighborhood. How dare you?" And then his brother, who lives with him, and his whole family lives with him, got up and said, "This is a single family neighborhood. I live with my brother. How dare you?" And it was like, there's 14 people living in your house. So,
Right.
just, it's a,
We also take a real soft gloves approach to administering the definition of a family. It has to be like egregious before we've really enforced on anybody, because one, who are we to say that you are or aren't a family under today's definitions? It's limited by state code to a certain number of people, and we aren't Rexburg, right? We're not a college town. We're not Springdale, which is the entry point of a major national park. So we're not dealing with the houses that tend to get like renting closets out as bedrooms type of issues. So it has to be like a major problem with several complaints before we go in, because it's up to us. The city has to prove that you are or are not a family. And if it's like a nuclear family with cousins and they have their own, marriage and kids, and then you've got grandparents in it, like you have multi-generational houses, and you just, that's the way people are, they have always lived, but are living right now under the
Yeah.
market conditions.
And that's the flip side of unaffordable housing in some way.
Yep.
Could get a lot
Absolutely.
worse.
Since this is a work session, I'll make a comment on this, just kind of thinking about this, and I've been thinking about it a little bit. I think that, these zones where this is already set and the fact that the legislature is going to continue to dictate more density because affordability is an issue is something that we probably have less control over. But I think it begs the question of our open space and continued development. And what I think it underscores is if we can keep green space and build things out,
Mhm.
we're going to be better off.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You know, I think that's, you know, when it comes to this and kind of the feedback, I think that would be my feedback is, I think it just highlights the fact that if, great, we're going to have density. That's wonderful. You know, we're still in a situation here, unlike they are in Salt Lake, that you got to put everything 6 inches from one another.
Right.
You know, if there's an affordability possibility in certain areas where there can be a group of buildings where people can actually afford them, and then there can be a chunk of green space that's actually managed by what people pay to live in that area, our city's going to be much better off, I believe,
Yeah.
than if everything's 6 inches from one another and there's no green space.
I agree. I was a little surprised this year because we had heard a lot of rumblings about it in the legislative session, but currently for detached accessory dwelling units, our city code requires 20,000 square foot lots, which is just under half an acre. So 43,560 is 1 acre. I can see the legislature coming in and putting that number closer to like between 6 and 10,000 square foot that
Yeah.
requires a detached ADU. We have had several residents who've come in and asked about small, tiny homes or a detached ADU over a detached, like an ADU over a detached garage on a lot that does not meet the 20,000 square foot. But we haven't had that person interested enough to bring in a zoning text amendment to make it happen yet. So I've polled several cities, and about 10 or 12 years ago, Farmington changed their code down to like 8,000 square feet, and the net change for the city was negligible. It's still a significant investment in the lot, like for you to do an ADU. And there's a lot of I would say there's a lot of hidden density right now in multi-generational homes. So the question then becomes, would you rather live the same number of people are going to live there? It's grandma and grandpa or mom and dad and the kids, and then the kids, right? And they're just living in the basement of the home. Is that any better, worse, or indifferent than if they were in their own 400 square foot unit that's sitting in the backyard of a 10, 12, or 15,000 square foot lot, of which we have several thousand in the city, because it won't change the fact of the total number of people living there, right? It's just where they are, and now they have their own little bit of privacy in the backyard. So I would expect that to change. And when we open up 11(9)(m)(9) accessory dwelling units, to include all of the residential zones, that would be a time for the public to weigh in on what is your desired minimum lot size that has a detached accessory dwelling unit. We're not even required to allow them right now by state code. It's just the IADUs, internal ADUs, are attached. But I can see that being something that changes over time, either legislatively or that we should be considering what's the right size for our city.
I think what you're saying is very likely the way we get to 50,000 residents in North Ogden. And I think you can even look at the type of homes that were built in different generations.
Mhm.
You know, I think the houses that were built in the 50s that are closer to here, they have big lots.
Yep.
And so
Big
there's
houses, big,
there- yeah.
a lot of rooms, big families.
Totally. And so those houses will be remodeled, and there will be multiple families living in that, because it's either going to be parents with kids, or it's going to be, two young couples, or those types of trends that we're seeing. And then I think also we have a lot of houses that were built like in the 90s, where it was very common to do a kitchen in the basement.
Yep.
Like it's there.
Mhm.
All the plumbing's there. It's pretty cost effective to say somebody's going to live in our basement.
Yeah.
And again, that's going to be either a relative or someone they want to rent it out to, because just the numbers are going to bear it out.
Right. Yep.
You know, I mean, I would say upwards of like 30% of our residential housing will probably convert to that over the next 20 years.
And
You know, and
so,
it sounds so aggressive. Like 5 years ago, I wouldn't have thought that, but I see that potentially happening.
and we're seeing, it's interesting because we use rental business licenses as the marker for a true accessory dwelling unit. Because if we called every dual kitchened house an accessory dwelling unit, it'd be like all of them. I mean, there's a canning kitchen in the basement of like every new home that's built essentially. So we use intent to rent through a business license as our marker. And that's just what we've chosen as specifically for the moderate income housing plan in how we track it, because it's an easy report to run from our building, our business license official, Colleen, can just tell me at the end of the year, there were 15 or 25, or there's this number of rental business licenses, but that does not accurately reflect the number of convertible spaces that exist in the city. But I'm hesitant to, unless the house is built specifically with a secondary entrance, non-shared or shared wall, but non-shared access ADU, I'm really hesitant to track those because we don't know what their intent is. Like that could be just a family and they stick their teenagers down there because they're tired of how noisy they're being upstairs. These numbers, again, I'll say it again, like we know we're wrong in the total number of ADUs that we're counting in the city, but we're consistently wrong because we're using the same metric year over year to count them.
Yeah.
And that may change or adjust in the future. But as a planning commission, I would think about, go home and look at your own backyard and look at your neighbor's backyard and as you drive around the city, think, what would the effect be, or what would it look like on some of these lots that are between 10 and 15,000 square feet, which is like the bread and butter lot that we have in North Ogden. What would the effect be if there was a drop-in backyard accessory dwelling unit? And what effect would we see? And how does that differ from someone's ability to construct a rather large accessory building? And then, in my opinion, like the accessory building standards and the ADU standards should probably kind of align more closely, which they don't right now, but that's a personal preference in administering the code. But that's why this is a bigger issue. This isn't just a simple text amendment. That one alone could eat up a whole planning commission meeting of discussion, right? So be thinking about that. And let's jump to every city planner's favorite thing and something for 17 years I can't seem to stop dealing with, which is chickens. You didn't,
More of those. now,
you
too.
didn't get
Egg
on.
prices are up.
Yeah, $10 for
We're gonna-
12 eggs. To steal our chickens. There are a few issues with our 11(9)(m)(10) animals and fowls. First is that when this section went in, there was a permit. A permit for chicken keeping may be revoked upon the conviction of the permit holder of a violation of this section. To my knowledge, the planning department never created the permit, never collected the $5 permit fee. And if we did, it might have been like the first few people after this code was written that we did. But since then, we aren't administering it. So our recommendation is to remove the permit and the fee and then amend the consolidated fee schedule to pull it out. So that's like a briefer for that specific one. But the other one is that there's a reference to a chicken coop cannot be any closer than 25 feet to another dwelling. And codes like this, and we'll get to the next one with swimming pools when we get down to it, they are a who came first rule. So if a house is constructed, and this is my question to the planning commission is, house one gets constructed in a cul-de-sac, they're always cul-de-sacs, it's always problematic. And they build their chicken coop with their house. And then the second person comes in and applies for a building permit. Should we disallow their house to get their building permit in that location because
too
it
close.
then creates a non-conforming use of the chicken coop? And the answer is, of course, no. We let them build their house knowing that there's an inconsistency. But the proximity to other houses one 25 feet was probably like pulled out of the air as a number, because a stinky chicken coop can be smelled for a much further distance than 25 feet. So this comes down to like a maintenance issue more than anything. And they were probably just grappling with, I know I don't want a chicken coop to be right on the property line or be affecting my neighbor or in my side yard. So let's just pick a number. But we have many, I mean, I know of several that exist and are clean and are good and are well kept. And those people love their chickens, and eggs are $10 a dozen and they're causing no harm. So we aren't, it's not a code enforcement thing that we're out there tracking, right? So should it exist? So the question for the planning commission is, what's the proper distance, and or should there be one? And my personal and kind of professional recommendation is that we should remove any references in the code that come down to like a who came here first type of question, because it becomes unfair to administer for the second homeowner if they can't get their chicken coop because the first one was already disallowed it, essentially. So be thinking about how close should a chicken, and go find a stinky chicken coop on like a wet rainy day too. That's,
I mean, the city's not getting a lot of complaints about chicken coops.
man, we get so many weird complaints. I can't even tell you, but we don't, it's honestly, it's only when they're really bad. And then they become like health violations almost. They become animal control and health
Right.
violations. The really well-kept ones, you wouldn't even know that they're there. And they're in everything from real small lot up to like animal husbandry, large lot, multiple chicken type stuff. And we do permit them everywhere. So it comes down to how they're
Do
kept.
we still require a permit when you
It-
say we permit them?
The code requires a permit, but I know for a fact we are not collecting $5 nor
Okay.
giving
So
it.
They're allowed.
We get a land use permit for the coop, like an accessory building, but we don't permit the animals.
Correct.
So do we even need a distance? I mean, do we even need this section in there?
Probably not, because what would happen if this section didn't exist, then the proximity of the coop would be restricted just to a small accessory building. They're typically,
Small shed.
yeah, they're typically less than 200 square feet, 10 by 20. So it would be, if it's under 10 feet tall, it could be as close as 3 feet to the property line, which right now to get 25 feet from a neighboring property, in some cases, some rear yards have 20-foot setbacks. So you're like putting the chicken coop 5 to or more feet into your property and like centered on your lot to miss that 25 feet. Where this would let you kind of stick it in the corner of your lot, and you might be a little closer to neighbor 1 than neighbor 2. But again, standing at their backyard, they're not going to notice the difference of whether it's there, in one location or 10 feet to the west.
Are you looking at suggestions or input from us at this moment, or
I would, yeah. And Ryan's taking notes. So what, do you have a
anybody
thought?
anybody have any thoughts, or like, why
I
do I
like,
need
I like
this?
the idea.
Yeah, just getting.
Yeah, it's
Getting rid of it.
eliminating that stuff, I think.
And then we could, because we could always reference, chicken coops are accessory buildings, basically. And then it just gets administered
this
that same,
section,
yeah,
yeah.
it gets administered that same way. That would be
Then that would put it, you said it's 3 feet off the property line? Is
currently,
that-
yeah, our current accessory building standard for like a tough shed that you would buy can be no closer than 3 feet to a property line.
And I guess our logic here is if it's a stinky coop, 25 feet versus 3 probably doesn't make a large difference. Is
Well,
that the thought process?
The question is,
No.
the 25 feet from the neighbor, the 3 feet to the property line probably matters less than 3 feet, but on one side of the lot might be like 21 feet to this house and 27 feet to that house or
Right.
whatever. So like, that's where they're having to move them kind of into the center of their lots in order to legalize them.
Right.
Where the perceived like smell of it is limited,
Yeah.
or the effects of that chicken coop. And we disallow roosters altogether. Those we do have code enforcement complaints, and we have to remove roosters. But
Crows that go.
yeah, the yeah.
Okay. And this, you said any changes to go, will be a public hearing
Yeah, this
Yeah.
is one that we'll actually extract this one out and it'll be its own public hearing and its own zoning
As I was
text
saying,
amendment.
I bet that some citizens might be uncomfortable with the change of the distance, but
So, and that to me begs the question, like, how do we
Yeah.
effectively notice this? Because we
Right.
don't have the budget to mail 5,000
right.
residents. I would love to. And we don't have the North Ogden Connection magazine anymore. We have a newsletter, so the mayor could maybe mention it in the newsletter if we time it correctly. You can sometimes get a leaflet in a utility bill, but not everybody takes their utility bills by paper anymore. And even that costs. So trying to effectively administer the public hearing part of this is going to be hard. My concern, or your concern, what you should be concerned about, is that we will change the code. It will affect somebody negatively. They will realize the code was changed, but weren't notified, and then they'll come and tell us that
Yeah.
we were bad
Mhm.
actors in
Yeah.
not notifying them.
And the state did give us a little cushion in that they kind of said, look, if there's a rule that's like generally applicable,
Yeah.
like here's what you do. But Scott's right, because someone's going to hear about it because their neighbor's going to be like, ha ha, gotcha. You got to move the chickens out.
Yep.
Right. And
Right.
yeah, sometimes
And-
people weaponize our code enforcement.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of look at it the opposite way, where there might be many people out there who would love to have chickens right now, but maybe their
Absolutely.
property isn't really allowing them if
I-
it has to be 25 feet. And
Sure.
I would think there would be more
I
citizens
think so.
in this community that would love to have this
True. I
information.
think it's one of those that could be potentially hot button issue both directions.
And I think the net effect is that a change of removing the 25-foot would likely just immediately legalize a lot of stuff that is sitting out there in the wrong spot, and that the homeowner didn't know it was wrong. They
Didn't
didn't,
even know there was
they
an
didn't
ordinance.
act inappropriately. They just didn't even realize that they
Yeah.
shouldn't have put that.
John,
there.
does the state allow us to, where it's generally applicable like this, do they allow us to not do a mailer?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's not a mailer, but there is kind of like you got to do your public notice and so you still do some of
website.
the other stuff,
Yeah.
and they kind of use some language, it's like the best, most practical notice you can. It's kind of this weird, like,
Yeah.
you have to put an effort into it. So newsletters probably the best, and the utility bills.
Yeah.
And these are things
See
that
the
we don't have
Facebook
to,
page.
we don't have to move quickly either. Like this
Yeah.
could be one that might sit on the planning
say
commission
kick it down the-
agenda like two or
Take it
three
down the road
times.
as long as you can.
And then just
and
let
then
it be.
Don't miss the opportunity to do that
Right.
type of notice. And then wait for the chicken people to show up and deal with it and move on.
And-
But for everybody who watched the Brent Bateman video, which with me now, which I think is everybody in the room, the time for the public, this is the orange cones theory, like the time for the public to interface with us is now in determining where those chicken coops should be. Because once we remove it from the code and we administer it effectively, like they're back to, we have to go back to the legislative process, go back to planning commission and city
Mhm.
council to put it back in. But people don't pay attention to it until all of a sudden all their backyards of their neighbors have chicken coops, and then they're real concerned about it because it's been creating issues.
3 foot, yeah, and there are noises and smells that are potential, so that's only like, I just want
Yes,
to
right,
point that
okay.
out that.
Absolutely.
And also there's based on your lot size, it does limit the number of birds you can have.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
Like
That's-
15 an acre or something.
yeah, like that's a big, like,
Uh,
control of noises and smells, in the sense that no one's going to have like a commercial egg operation
no,
unless they're in the RE20
Three
zone with
hens
5 acres.
Don't make a ton of noise and they don't create a lot of smell.
no.
Yeah.
20 hens make a lot of noise
Mhm.
and make a lot of smell, cost a lot of feed and produce a lot of eggs.
I feel like
And
you
if they're
know
not
from
properly
experience.
Cleaned
have
up,
chickens, yeah.
you get
Yeah.
rodent issues, and
Not
as
a
a
lot, but
neighbor,
fewer.
yeah, and as
You
a
do.
neighbor, you can get rodent issues from your
Yes.
neighbor's lack of care.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
That's the only thing I want to kind of bring up, is that's
And we
a
have
reality.
issues in North Ogden. We're still a ag community in
Yeah.
a way. We've got,
dead rats you see on the road.
yeah, we got
Yeah.
lots of rats out there.
Yeah.
Get a warm winter and they
Yeah.
pop up, rats and mice.
So those are things for you to be thinking about. That's really helpful feedback for us when we bring it back to you. This is one that may come back with some recommendations for changes, but probably will come back
Well-
as its own discussion.
Scott, can
Yeah.
I say something?
Yeah.
So sorry, I did not catch if you mentioned there is conflicting setback code.
Mhm, yeah.
So
Yeah.
item or letter B mentions a 50-foot from any dwelling and 75 feet from any neighboring dwelling. But then it does mention further down a 25-foot setback. So there is currently, if you guys want to, I don't know how much we want to talk about it, but so when I get calls, my guidance from John is we apply the most restrictive. So we apply the 50 and the 75. But that's hard for people to swallow when they're like, well, here it's saying 25, right? And so it's, what do we want to apply? What setback? And with that, it's hard because the code says, they must be in a coop, which, like John said, is an accessory building. But then as well, we have a whole chart saying, hey, if you're in this zone at, less than half an acre, here's how many chickens you can have.
Okay.
And so it's hard to say, well, hey, it's saying I can have this many chickens, but then they have a coop, but then the coop won't meet the accessory building code, right? For setbacks.
If you have the number of chickens lower on smaller lots, like significantly lower, you're gonna have very few issues. Because 3 chickens just don't poop that much.
Yeah, and we'll review the numbers because it's a reducing based on your lot size. So that part, we already have like the diminishing curve.
Mhm.
To Ryan's point about administering code, my position as planning director has been when you have inconsistent code sections, you give the lesser of the lesser restrictive code to the person because it's our fault that we have 2 inconsistent codes and we need to clean that up. So it's like tie goes to the runner basically, or if there's 2 inconsistent things and the homeowner wants this, whichever one they want, we'll kind of give them to them. But generally we administer the less restrictive section of the code. Again, being that my position is generally to keep the city from getting sued is what I try to do. So,
Yeah.
And I'm usually the jerk.
and John corrects me when I err, which I appreciate.
What if maybe a potential move then to clear things up for Ryan? I mean, what if it could just be cleared to the 25-foot as a first step? I mean, I don't know if that's a pain in the butt to
Yeah.
do it with
Well,
a graduated, but at least cleaning it up to have one number listed as opposed to.
and we could do that if you're like, you know what, we know chickens are going to fill this room and we don't really want to deal with an entire night of talking to people about chickens. We can do that and just make it really simple and say, all we're going to do is correct the reference. But knowing the number of coops that are out there that don't meet the 25 feet to their neighboring dwelling, and it's mostly your own next door neighbor and the location of the coop. Because if you put it right kind of behind your garage or 6 feet behind your house, but right on the property line from there to your neighbor's corner of their house with a 10-foot side yard setback in R110 zone, you're not meeting 25 feet for sure. Like it, and we know, I mean,
There's lots.
we could jump on Google Earth and find several of them that we know, and they're not problematic. We haven't received code enforcement calls on it. So I think it warrants the question altogether. But if you, as as the planning commission, if it's like, I don't want to deal with this, just correct the one inconsistent number to make them consistent to 25, we can definitely do that.
And then it sounds like, Ryan, there is a separate thing that says like on this size lot, this is how many chickens you can have and all that, right?
Yeah.
Chicken chart.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there is a chart. So
Okay.
it's hard when it's been recently because I've gotten very many calls
Mhm.
where they're looking to get chickens. And I'm like, well, our code can be confusing, but like, here's the chart of how many you can have in your zone at your lot size, but you have to meet these, has to have a coop, and there's all these requirements, but the setback is a big one. Where it does say 50 to your home and 75 to adjacent homes. But then also there's this old reference, I guess, an old setback of 25. And, I want to give them as much information as know, but when it conflicts that way, then they're like, well, then it's hard to guide them, what can they do? Because
And circling back to that comment earlier about different development styles, it's almost safe to assume that if your home is 20 years old or newer, you cannot legally fit a chicken coop in your backyard, period. And that's half or more of our residential units.
And
So-
that's probably the calls you're getting Ryan, I suppose.
Yeah, there,
So,
No,
so having to answer all these calls of this renewed interest, what is your sense of what's a reasonable distance or, I mean, what is your sense of?
I wanted to pull up an example.
I don't know
if I
anything
could
about
remember
chickens.
where it was, but this owner came in and I mean, he's on the smallest lot I think we allow, but his neighbor, and he was looking to do chickens and his neighbor does as well, has currently a coop. And it was like, they have like maybe a triangle shaped lot. And they did have a coop, but it's like right behind the fence, not on property line, but it's clearly not meeting setbacks. But they've placed it in a way that, it's gonna be away from neighbors, as far away from their neighbors as they could put it. And I mean, he was just looking to do the same thing of get some chickens in his yard, but his home is clearly at the 20 foot from his property line, probably at the 8 foot from the side yard. Like his yard was very small, so the only place to put it is on property line, which he couldn't meet anyways. But it's hard to say, well, it does look like our code does say like if you can have this many chickens on this zone at, under half an acre, you can have 10 chickens, but you can't fit the coop, right?
Mhm.
Um,
So Ryan, I pulled up the chicken chart and
Yeah.
as a thought for the commission and for you too, if we were to look at removing this section and defaulting to the accessory dwelling setback, it does allow up to 10 hens, even in some of our smaller residentially coded lots. And for example, like you were mentioning with new development, lots are small. 10's a lot. So maybe a consideration could be if we were to remove this section and go to the 3 foot, we reduce it to, you were maybe thinking
Just cut it in half to 5.
5. I mean, I don't, 10 is noisy. Yeah, or half a dozen, 6, I mean, nice even number.
Well, staff will take that on, and one of the things that we'll do in extracting that and making it its own code is we'll do the same thing of reviewing several cities' codes. So we'll see if we're right-sized, more or less restrictive, and we'll bring some recommendations, but that's it. These are things for you to think about moving forward, and
Cause on here, it does list all of the zones and some of them are larger, so 10 might make sense, but I don't know if that's the case.
But
in
if
a-
we no longer have the
Exactly,
distance
and
to
your
another,
3 foot
yeah,
to your
so maybe,
neighbors.
maybe we
And-
should have a rethink about
Scott, I had,
taking that
oh,
out.
go ahead.
I had a comment.
Please, Warren.
What about you have the number of chickens for the lot size?
Yeah,
What if-
that's what I was gonna say is that the zoning in North Ogden, especially with RCC, R18 and R110, the zoning doesn't always match the lot size. We have lots of underlying larger lots in smaller zoned areas. So maybe it is just, maybe
And
it's
what if
directed
it's-
lot size.
They try to get as large a house as they can on a small lot versus a house that's a small house on a small lot.
Yeah.
Seems like the usable space in the backyard is more of a
That's a great idea.
issue versus the size of the lot.
John,
Very good point.
Yeah.
do you want to pull it up?
Sure.
I haven't, this is the example, and this,
I will say, while you're just real quick, that you can see this conversation, every city manager, this is always the conversation that takes the longest in any city it's ever discussed. When we put this code in place in 2014, I believe the meeting went to 1 a.m. with the city council. Just so you know, but yeah.
so it's 350 west, kind of way far, and 1825 north. So in our far west side of our city. So 1825 north,
Over
and
by
then
Harrisville.
it's in the 1775, so in that it's on the west kind of cul-de-sac elbow. So the neighbor that came in, he's up adjacent, so that's the chicken coop. He's up on the corner of 1825. Just
Kind of north
and
and west.
Dane Drive. So he's on the corner.
He's over
and
here.
his backyard neighbor has a, a slightly larger lot. But so he was, yeah, I mean, he has like an accessory building on his property line anyways. But he came in, was hoping to see if he could have chickens. Because he mentioned his neighbor, adjacent backyards. Said that one on the fence line near the home is a chicken coop. But it's like, well, you can't. And, probably technically, their neighbor's not meeting the chicken coop code either. So there's kind of a visual, I guess, of, these neighbors, they all are on small lots. I mean, they have accessory buildings not meeting our code either, but, it's hard when they come in and ask about chicken coops and chickens, and our code's not clear anyways.
I'll be ready to rip the Band-Aid off and do a 1 AM meeting and make it so we never have to talk about it again.
Right.
Yeah.
I think the suggestion about lot size makes a lot of sense because if you're buying a lot and you put a small home on it with the intention of having a rural type environment, I mean, I think that's a wise suggestion. So are we wanting to, do we have any consensus for recommendation then? Or are we thinking
It's one to think about, I think.
Okay.
Well, yeah, because in theory, we'll come back. I think what we'll do is we might try and eliminate the inconsistency with the small, it's the more ordinances, but it's the micro changes. But then we will plan a full discussion when I think I'm going to be in Hawaii that week. So.
Me too.
But so, and if the group's okay, we'll bifurcate it. So then you can give a real recommendation to the council on the, like Scott said, the blue stuff that we're going to bring back as larger discussions.
I feel like in
So-
January when everything's frozen.
So just for the cleanup, would you like something from us on like what to leave in there?
No, the way to think about this is 38 items and it's actually, I added one today. So by the time you see it next time, it'll be 37. But it's just the laundry list in numerical order of everything code we've been dealing with since adopting the new code. And what we'll do is we'll extract it out. So we'll pull out these items. So the next time you see it, you'll have a list of say 25 that are administrative. You recommend to city council approve because they're innocuous, missing references or inconsistencies or something. And then over here, we now have the stuff that we are going to talk about in its own individual item. So I don't need anything for a recommendation for a cleanup because you won't see it again as a cleanup item. It will be extracted out. And this is clearly one that needs a discussion of its own. And we're going to jump. So we have some fence regulations. The next one is number 19, the Century Farm Zone. And this was a zone that was created, had a development agreement, had a subdivision that went all the way through to final plat approval. And they were unable for almost 2 years to construct the subdivision. They came back and were able to get it rezoned to R4 with a similar development agreement. And we're now in the process of working through its final plat process and pre-construction and the roadway. They've already started putting fill material, if you notice, on the top side of Loman View, approximately in the location where 300 East will be coming up through that road. So if you get to Northern Ice and the backside of Lee's, that road will continue straight up through that next farm field, and there will be townhomes in that development. So my recommendation is to remove the Century Farm Zone, because as of right now, somebody could come in and request a rezone on any piece of property to Century Farm Zone, and it really only existed because it came with like funding and dedication of park space and all of these other individual agreement pieces. But that has to be its own larger thing. That one would be notified to residents surrounding it, which is going to be really confusing to them because it's already been rezoned to R4. Like we probably should have thought about doing those things as combined, like eliminate the Century Farm Zone from the code and apply R4, but we didn't do that. So right now, the other thought that staff had is the Century Farm Zone is a prototype of a small lot reduced setback zone. So we could also retool it into something like an R14. And then the city has a small lot zone that we could then use to rezone. And instead of creating, I'm not saying Quail Ponds was the wrong way to do it, but like instead of creating one-off PUDs that only affect a dozen or 20 homes or something like that over time, you just create the zone that's for small lot, single-family residential that might help us get to more affordable single-family standalone homes and have it as a standing code and allow people to apply for it. So
That's actually a good
that's-
idea
yeah.
because it goes back to the, there was green space
Right.
with that.
So maybe the note, Ryan, is that we'll look at the Century Farm Zone as a retooling of that code into more of, and we'll have that discussion again, but into more of like an at-large, could be applied in
But
other places.
just renaming it.
Yeah,
even-
it'd be probably a rename and pulling out anything that was highly specific to
Yeah.
that piece of property. That property had a really strange kind of Z shape to it that caused it to have some specifics in there. Okay, we'll roll back down. There was a paragraph missing altogether in 21. That feels like a really large thing that we're putting in, but it's just because the old code, we had a paragraph dropped, which happens when your code was 175 pages. Everything in the anything related to the commercial zones used to say C2 or CP2, so that was commercial or commercial planned 2, are now either community commercial downtown or community commercial southtown, with 2300 north being the break line between them. So 2300 north and lower is CCST, 2300 north and north is CCDT. And I'll just tell you, the main difference between the two is we don't allow automotive businesses anymore in the downtown zone. So the current operating Jiffy Lube is a legal non-conforming use. Before Pool Works became Pool Works and it was the car sales auto lot, that was a legal non-conforming use with the changeover in the zoning map of CCDT versus ST. But as of right now, a new Big O or a new car sales lot could happen on Washington from 2300 north and south, from 2300 north south to our border, which is about 1500 north. That's the main difference between the two zoning codes, but we have lots and lots of old C2 or CP2 references that need to be updated.
Yeah.
The,
Hey, can I
Yeah.
regress a
you
bit?
can, please.
I was looking under this residential fencing regulations.
You're 18.9M
Yeah,
or 11.
11.9,
On 18, number 18.
number 18. We mentioned our 40-foot triangular section for the site triangle.
Correct.
It's no longer 40 feet.
You're right. And so I'll tell you what we've done.
It's,
But
that's
yeah.
the new one.
It's 30 by 100. It's two converging 30 by 100 triangles. And Lauren was here when that,
Engineering standards.
yep.
was
So
approved.
what we've done is anywhere that referenced in Title 11, a 40-foot Clearview triangle, we've eliminated the reference altogether and said, go to City Public Works Standards sheet RD07 or RD08, where that shows just exactly what Lauren has.
So I
pulled.
was just, anytime we're mentioning the 40-foot triangle, maybe trying to find where those are in the code and.
Yep. And there's a few, there's fencing regulations, there's one in streetscape standards. So there are a few
you
of
use
those
the
that,
ones
and that's a great
that are-
catch. So we'll make sure we administer it. Okay, let's jump down to 27, design and location of parking spaces. This is an interesting one, and Lauren, maybe you have a little backstory or John knows. There's a blue section in here that is right now no access driveway. So think of an access off of a street entering into a commercial location. No access driveway may be closer than 20 feet from a street intersection, which makes a lot of sense. That's one parked car between a stop sign and the entrance point, nor any closer than 10 feet from any property line. And that section specifically is problematic, and I'll
That
give you
is-
the.
That is,
I'll give you the Bank of Utah example. So right now where Zion's Bank is and Bank of Utah's building next door, their drive access straddles their property line. And there are lots of commercial areas where the access straddles the property line because it provides access to the, one or the other. So that 10 feet from any property line is very problematic. For residential, your curb approach that is cut in that has like the triangle wings, the approach itself can be no closer than 5 feet to the property line. But once you get behind sidewalk, we don't care if your driveway goes all the way to the property line. It's just that approach. And the reason for that is so that we can irritate you later when the fiber company comes in and digs up your park strip, because they're doing it on both people's property and or your property. But it's largely where all of your secondary water meters, culinary water meters, your gas line runs in there, any pressure relief valves or fire hydrants, like those all get located in that 5 foot. So for residential, I'm comfortable with leaving 5 foot, but I think we should get rid of 10 feet from any property line. And if you want to restrict like multiple accesses that one of them needs to sort of like be pulled away, maybe there's a reason to, but I don't know why this is in here. And I know we're not administering it effectively.
and I don't think it matches up with, if you look at the driveway standards,
Right.
it doesn't have that 10 foot on there in the engineering standards.
Okay.
So,
Any thoughts, concerns, questions?
In the rest of it here. So this would apply to residential and commercial, just commercial.
Not in this section 11. Let me check.
It's only, the 1119 is parking lots and parking spaces.
Yeah.
So it typically wouldn't, but there is, as Scott mentioned, a 10-foot restriction on residential lots.
5 foot.
5 foot.
Oh, 5 foot, right.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
unless you
Yeah.
talk to my neighbor who built one right on the front.
Yeah, this section of the code, 1119.3, design and location of parking spaces, has section A as single family residences. And then the next section is garages, and then C is all uses except as provided above. So that would fall into all commercial uses, manufacturing uses, and civic uses. I mean, we're restricting ourselves. It would be any and all of them. And there probably was a good reason why someone at some point said, yeah, you probably shouldn't be able to have the main access be any closer than 10 feet to a property line. But anymore, we have so many shared accesses that this really is inconvenient. I mean, the entirety of Kurtz Plaza, for instance, is almost entirely shared accesses because they each individually have a piece of their property that touches Washington Boulevard, and the drive aisle crosses several property lines. So I'd probably pull that 10 foot.
That last section after.
Yeah, that last
Nor
paragraph.
any
Mhm.
closer.
Yeah.
Anybody have any issue?
I'm good with that.
Okay.
Good.
The next one, this could probably be administrative, but again, I don't like to make substantive changes this way, is that number 29, in the commercial zones, within this section, the minimum vegetative coverage is 20%. But when you go to 1110A3F, which is a chart, like an Excel spreadsheet of all zones and their landscaping standards, that indicates 10%. And staff has, for the last 4 years I've been here, staff has been administering the 10% landscape standard for all commercial zones. So we're not using the more restrictive, but our code still has one area where it is more restrictive. So, but again, I want planning commission to weigh in on it and the council to weigh in on it, because if in your city you determine that commercial areas should have more landscaping, then we can up that back to 20. That's it's definitely more of a suburban commercial standard, and we're getting we get pushback already at 10% landscaping, honestly. But our recommendation will be 10% is probably reasonable in commercial areas.
Could we do 10 and then require like larger caliper trees to begin with.
You can do all sorts of fun stuff, yeah.
I mean, that might be a thought is
Maybe that's the trade-off.
10 or even less, but require larger trees to be put in. Because larger trees are likely to live.
But you said we've been consistently doing the 10.
Yeah, we've been wrong consistently.
Yeah.
My favorite way to be wrong.
But you know, if it's in the code and there's, you know, somebody who reads our code to see what they have to have and they see the 20%. I mean, I think we're in this era where we're trying to attract new developers and commercial businesses, you know. So
And-
I would err on the side. That's my personal opinion, but you guys chime in. I don't have any problem with 10%. I want to make it as easy as possible for
Yeah.
economic
yeah.
development.
Every
at this
site
point.
plan you've reviewed, so Mountain
fantastic.
America Credit Union, Bank of Utah, those were both 10% when Nielsen's came in. Nielsen's Frozen Custard is 10%. The whole entirety of is it Crossroads Plaza? I get it mixed up, but where the Smiths is and all of those, that's 10%. So we've been administering 10% for several years. This 20% has just sort of, I think it's one last hanging on reference.
What about the word vegetative cover versus
It
now
should,
they
yeah.
have
it should
other
probably be protective. So
materials?
yeah, we have another section of our code that talks about protective ground cover, and then that has a definition of rocks, bark, mulch, waterwise landscaping. Like it has some specific pieces, and that allows for more waterwise landscaping. That's a great point. Because we definitely want to be leaning that way. I mean, that's just waterwise
Mhm.
as a whole. So that's a great comment and I hope Ryan's taken all these really good notes.
He's got
I
it.
hope so. Yeah, me too.
So water-wise
Very good.
coverage and 10%.
Yeah, so we would go 10% and then eliminate vegetative and probably use our other referenced section that's protective ground cover.
I
you
think
okay
that's
with that?
just the definition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to number 31. General provisions, signs on public property. We generally don't allow signs on public property. We do for ourselves, every once in a while we'll put up our own sign, but the intersection of this is political campaign signs. That's kind of what you've got to wrap your head around. And the, I'll help you sell your house, or I'll help you, be an investor and make $1 million. Like any of those corrugated plastic signs that just pop up in park strips are generally disallowed. And in signs on public property, there is a section that says, except as authorized in, and there's a code reference that I'm not totally sure whether it even should exist, because when you go to like 1121.7, it just disallows signs on public property altogether. So it's saying, unless you go to this code section, which doesn't allow it, they're kind of not allowed. And this is one that we need to just clean up, or the planning commission, I want guidance from the planning commission. Should we permit any type of signs on public property that aren't things like the Build Barker Park signs that are sitting over there on Fruitland in Barker Park and were put in by the city? That's a sign on public property. Like we have, those are flag signs that whether we allowed them or we have not made them remove them. I don't know. And then,
I don't think we put them in, but the Build Barker Park Committee put them in.
okay,
Maybe with our permission.
maybe, yeah. So those are types of signs. Around events, cherry days, we end up with signs on public property. But the thing I'm really trying to protect here is that we don't end up with park strips plastered with political signs. And John will tell you that the interesting thing about a political sign is that you can't read it to determine if it's a political sign. And that is by state code. So
US code.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court said if you have to read the sign to decide if it belongs or not, you're impacting free speech.
so
That's fascinating.
So vote for North Ogden's Best Sandwich Shop, and then that sandwich shop has logoed that sign. I don't know if that is or isn't a political sign.
Hmm.
How would we know?
Yeah.
These are hard questions to administer, like when are trees a fence? So,
Well,
So the cleanup that would just be No signs.
Just we disallow signs altogether on
Right.
public property, or maybe it's disallowing all signs within public right of way. Because then that would give us and the library and the senior center some flexibility to go out and put temporary signs as appropriate on our own property.
Or at a
that-
park or something.
Yeah, for an event like the community band or for fireworks or some other display or something that's coming in that's a short-term event, then we can use the short-term event type of signage, but would not necessarily allow a political sign to sit out there for 6 months during campaign season.
I'm supportive of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would-
Seems like a no-brainer,
Okay.
but maybe not. No, please.
No, in a home business, you just have to have that sign up on private property and not in the,
Right, this is
Yeah.
only.
Public right of way.
public
For the
property.
public, because if.
well,
if your
right of
home-
way,
Oh, I
right?
see, in the right of way.
Yeah.
in the right of way, in the
Yeah.
parkway.
Because you're saying if we say the right of way.
Right.
And the same is for home sale signs, like the for sale signs. Those have
Yeah.
to be in the front yard, not in the park strip.
On the park
And so a home occupation, which is limited to like a 4 square foot sign, it's really small. Home occupations get just a very reasonable size sign. Could be a wall placard or just like a yard sign in their yard. And that's
Okay.
totally fine and,
Okay.
and legal. It's just, it keeps it out of the park strip. Yeah.
Good.
And I think it's because typically, right, that's where these land. That's what people jump out of cars, stick them all in the park strips, often
Mm.
without property owner permission, right? That sort of
Which
thing.
is horrible.
Can we legally collect those now?
Anything on our property, we can pick up. We don't necessarily. If we get a complaint, then it's usually code enforcement or me, just because I don't want anyone else doing it. But so I keep a utility knife in my truck and I take signs down if we get complaints. In particular, political signs. People hang them on our park fences and stuff.
Yeah.
Is no one else bothered by all of the like signs everywhere in the park strips for like cleaning services and
Yeah,
Yeah,
roof
I think
services?
Yeah,
those
they're-
things should be gone.
Yeah, they're terrible.
Yes.
Call non-emergency police and they'll drive by and pluck them.
Okay,
Yeah, and it's just.
But I
litter.
can't do
Like,
it.
leave 'em and they blow.
I'm just kidding. I'm just
Right.
kidding. I'm not asking
I'm not
you
going
on
to say what the
official forum.
liability there is or isn't. So- Okay, let's run back down to the next. There's a bunch of other commercial issues that are there. This is a really interesting one. So number 35. The current code says that in recreation sites, so land reserved for public recreation purposes shall be of a character and location suitable for use as a playground or for other recreation purpose, and shall be relatively level and dry, improved by the developer to standards required by a development agreement, which improvements shall be included in the performance bond or escrow. And then the part we're recommending taking out. The planning commission may refer any subdivision proposed to contain a dedicated park to the Parks and Recreation Department for a recommendation. This is, by the time it gets to you, that conversation should have happened way prior. And so what we're recommending, and then I'll talk about the yellow code because the yellow portion is problematic. But in lieu of that, we would like to say the Parks and Recreation Department should make or shall make recommendations for dedicated parks within subdivisions during the technical review process in 1124 prior to the Planning Commission reviewing a subdivision plat. So you've received a staff recommendation prior to you weighing in on it. Now, the last sentence is so interesting to me. All land to be reserved for dedication to the city for park purposes shall have prior approval of the city council and shall be shown marked on the plat, quote, reserved for park and or recreation purposes. So if you think of land use law, or you think of law as your rights as a bundle of sticks, you have, as the city, certain of these bundle of sticks, and you are the land use authority as dedicated by the state's Land Use Development Management Act and by our code. But what we're doing is when a developer proposes a public park, you are giving up that right and you're passing it over to the city council to say, do you agree with this? And prior to that in here, it talks about this happening through a development agreement, which that development agreement is by necessity legislative because you can't bind the city with a contract. So there's a bit of a circular reference here, and I can't decide if it was written to say anytime a developer proposes open space that will be dedicated to the city, it shall require a development agreement, or if it's just saying anytime that happens and they want to dedicate land, we have to add a step and take it to the city council, which then gives city council authority at that time. You know, what if they start weighing in on the size of it and that affects lot sizes and it affects street widths and it affects, you know, like the downside is that this should be where all administrative decisions for subdivisions happen, and unless there's a development agreement.
And
And
Scott, this could have been part of the prior way that subdivisions were approved,
Mhm.
and council was involved in those approvals.
Yep, in final
Where
plat
now
plans.
it just goes through planning commission and staff.
Yep. So I would say you strike it. And what would happen is you as the land use authority, in the same way that planning commission authorizes the dedication of streets. And that's one of your biggest administrative things you do is as this board, you have all this power to authorize landowners to sell lots for the trade-off that they give us improved streets that we then maintain and manage forever, right? And the city councils used to love to be a part of that process because they think about budgets and snow plowing and all other stuff. But really, it just comes down to a land use item. So I say we likely strike it, and anything up above that's related to a development agreement is fine. It can exist because you can always decide to do a development agreement, and those development agreements may happen prior to the subdivision or may not. It depends on their legislative, like choose your own adventure track of how it happens. But I really dislike anything that's giving up subdivision land use authority from the planning commission, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with that. I
Agreed.
think the cost of land has shifted a lot in the last 20 years or whatever. And this was probably like, yeah, the cost of the roads, but also the cost of maintaining a park,
Yeah.
which now the cost of land, like the city, any land that is dedicated to us to preserve for open space is an asset.
It is, and we're well, without saying too much about any individual project, it oftentimes is monetized and like because the developer understands the cost of land. And so they'll request through the development agreement process, can you reduce my impact fees by the equivalent amount of dollars that I paid for X amount of land that I'm now giving you as a park? And we have negotiated, I mean, that's a point of negotiation in development agreements that the legislative body handles. But to me, those development agreements should be done at the legislative level. So that happens at the time of a rezone, so that you have a zone and a development agreement, and that creates the full sandbox of rules and regulations that they get to play in. And then it comes administratively to the planning commission for you to say, does this meet zoning code X plus the requirements of the DA? And if it does, then it's a go. And if it doesn't, then it's not a go. And so
That's the right check and balance
Just
for
that it's a no.
it's a no. Dang it. It's not even that late. I'm just, not thinking quick. Think if it's a.
Yeah.
So we will, with that recommendation, we'll make that change. And I think
Oh.
that's a sort of substantive change, but also not, because the state has asked us already to determine who is your land use authority, and we have determined it's you as the planning commission. And so I love Lauren's explanation. Like, this is probably just an old holdout of when final plats used to go to city council for approval because the mayor signs them. And we've reached the end of our major point. We did have there in the old code, well, as Rob Scott left, there was reference to a sensitive lands ordinance, and there is a healthy sensitive lands ordinance that has been pre-written, and we've reviewed, but has not come forward and has not been adopted by the council. In his kind of aspiration of adopting the sensitive lands ordinance, it was written into the code change in a few places. And so what we've done is we've extracted the word sensitive lands ordinance because it doesn't exist. And we've referenced then the subdivision development constraints, which is very similar. The development constraints talks about, if you went to that link, things like wetlands, steep hillsides, rocky areas, natural outcroppings. What it doesn't do, that the sensitive lands ordinance would have done, is protect all the scrub oak on the hill. And the sensitive lands ordinance was much more kind of pointed and defined in areas that you can and can't develop, not just to say areas over 20% slope or undevelopable. Like it had, and it will come back around. I mean, it's something that's going to come back around. And then just for your like thought to think about, is a full revamp of our sign code is necessary. Our sign code is really difficult to administer even for us. And that's everything from the political signs have gotten easier, but commercial sign standards and what is permitted and pole signs and heights, and it's really convoluted and difficult to administer.
I would suggest a whole work session
Uh-huh.
for the city on commercial signs.
Okay.
Like, I think that you look at the signs and we have a lot of signs that are outdated. We've got signs that, like, our city looks worse because of our sign policy. And if we could implement something that had a better signage policy, I think it would have a tremendous impact.
Yeah, I agree. And if you want to find out, if you want to see there's a few of them, but the maximum monument sign size that one can obtain in the city of North Ogden, PACTAX maximized theirs, Alan Curb's physical therapy office maximized theirs. So those are like at the peak of what a monument sign can do. And then an really interesting one, and I'm pretty sure that Bullfrog Spas won this case against the city and or won a determination, is that his truck, there's an old military truck on the corner of 2000 that's an off-premise sign because it's across the street in Kavanaugh's. That's his sign. And he gets to keep his, I mean, it's a really cool old military truck that he keeps a spa on the back of, but that is a sign. That is his.
For that, just that the code wasn't restrictive enough to disallow that?
No, it's much better than that.
Okay.
The reason for that is we don't restrict UTA bus signs because it still moves. He can drive it around. It's it's the
Interesting.
same reason why
What?
Ryan Ivy has all those trailers around the realtor, right?
I love that.
Bobblehead Ryan Ivy.
Yeah. So that's the reason is you start interpreting, because we're obviously not going to get after UTA because they park occasionally. So it's just weird. One of those fun nuances.
How about, okay, let's get deep into law and say that it has to move every 15 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. Like the bus.
It can't.
Yeah, I mean the buses too.
What's the
Yeah.
appropriate time?
So
the sign can
Bullfrog
be
has to
parked?
back the truck up, hire somebody just to do that.
Don probably would. It's a neat truck. I mean,
Yeah. I'll tell you we've talked about, and I don't know if I've sold Scott on this because I'm just surprised he's admitting we need to fix the sign ordinance. No, not admitting, but wanting to.
not me.
Voluntary.
But I've often wondered if you could do a sign ordinance that's strictly based on street frontage. So depending on the size of your street frontage is how big your sign can be, because some of those lots that are really narrow have large orange signs, and it's bigger than not than the Kurt sign, but
Proportionally to
it sticks out more than the Kurt sign does because of how big the frontage is for Kurt. So it's this
What's
weird,
the-
And I'll bring up the next current issue, and I'm going to have a conversation with him on Friday. So this is an immediate issue that we need to figure out, is that for Barker Depot, which is where America First Credit Union they're relocating to the corner. That's, pretty public. They haven't received, you will receive their site plan application within the next few weeks. Next planning commission meeting, you will see 2 new drive-throughs coming in that are between what will be the new AFCU and Mountain America Credit Union. But the developer has sold individual lots to each building as they've gone. They haven't maintained it as one, where if you look at the plat map of the Crossroads Plaza, Wells Fargo is its own lot and Wendy's is its own lot and Starbucks, but everything else. So Fizz, Crumble, T-Mobile, all of that stuff,
It's
the
all-
Ace,
Hmm.
and then the Kroger is all one large area. And that's why they have two large multi-tenant signs, and they're not off-premise signs. And an off-premise sign is literally what it sounds like, but any sign that is indicating for a business and that's not physically appended or located on that property. The Trout Farm has an off-premise sign because the Trout Farm is on the west side of Fruitland, or the Trout Farm's on the east side, the sign's on the west side. But what they want to talk about is, where would you, if you were the developer of this large site, want to put that sign? And the answer was clearly the corner of Washington and 2600 North, which will be on America First Credit Union's property. But we'll have all of the tenants for
Hmm.
everything behind for Barker Depot. And under the current rules, the strict answer is no. Under we want to be reasonable and good to business, and we want a really successful area right there. The answer is, let's figure out what the answer is essentially. But we're meeting with the developer this week. So some corrections to the sign code might happen more quickly than others. And that one specifically might be, and I don't know the best way to fix it. It might be that it's like, you as a developer get to indicate what your combined site is, or maybe it's like via agreement. So AFCU and Mountain America and O'Reilly and the new two tenants, if everybody's willing to sign on with Leading Tech Development on Barker Depot and say, yep, that's the location of the sign, maybe that's the marker that we use for how to locate it. But as of right now, strict administration of the code is that it would be an off-premise sign. And then of course, AFCU wants to do their own pole or monument sign. So that's dual street frontage signage on a single property. And it's just this is why I don't want to open the sign code, is because it's really difficult and there are there's really no good answers. Like if you drive down Riverdale Road, the size of some of the signs that Riverdale Road permits is wild. Like they're billboard size signs, but the money that those car dealerships collectively bring in sales tax revenue for the city are worth the offset of having several 100 square foot signs permitted for each of those businesses, right? We unfortunately don't have that problem, because I would love to have a giant car dealership in North Ogden that would, pay my salary and sales tax, which would be great. But we do have to think about this from a practical, pragmatic standpoint, and from an economic development standpoint, and what's right for business, but is also protecting the city, because someone will figure out a way, if there's a potential for an off-premise sign, to screw us up and put a sign on, like, Leeds could maybe, and I hate picking on any one individual business. A different grocery store could maybe be like, hey, a business across the street is a better place for my giant sign, and it's off premise. So I'm just going to redraw my map on what constitutes my combined area and get them to sign it. And so now I can put a giant sign over there.
Mhm.
We luckily don't have to deal with billboard issues, but billboards have been used as off-premise signs in some cases, like through agreement with, Reagan's the difficult one out there. Clearfield dealt with that. But it's something to think about, and something I'll be dealing with Friday in considering how do I administer this, because it will show up on AFCU's site plan, and I might make planning commission weigh in on it.
Please
because-
do.
Okay.
Seriously.
Yeah.
What?
I think that's something that oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, please. I think I interrupted you.
Go ahead. You're much taller than me.
Actually, you were speaking first.
Yeah,
Did you-
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I don't think you.
Yeah.
Forgot what I was gonna say.
I'm
Other
really
than,
sorry.
I think that it would be great to have the backup of planning commission to weigh in on that. I think that the wrong sign at that intersection could have major impact on our city.
Yep.
You know?
Signage is usually a separate permit than the building permit.
Yep.
Couldn't we just add a conditional use permit application or process for signage? That lets you just decide how you want to do it?
Please no. I'd rather go through the pain and effort of rewriting the sign code collectively over several months and just get it done administratively, because it happens so often, and by the time the business is ready to open and they have the building permit ready for the sign, like they want it then. They don't want to wait 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks to hold a conditional use permit meeting with planning commission. And the land use ombudsman for the state for years and years, I think you know him. It was, I don't know,
Brent Bateman?
well, and the prior, and the one prior,
Oh,
actually,
Yeah, that guy.
had been-
He's a nut.
had been saying, eliminate as many conditional use permits from your city as possible. And the reason is because it's better to have a permitted use with a consistent set of standards. And the example is daycares. Like daycares used to be CUPs, and we would come in and we would apply the same standards over and over and over, but we would make people go through this stressful conditional use permit process.
And get the neighbors wound up thinking they could stop it.
Right,
Yeah.
which they can't, because in Utah, CUPs are permitted uses with conditions. So it just adds one stop in the road that if you wanted a CUP process, or like what would be better, similar but different, would be large tenant, multi-tenant signs as related to large commercial areas that exceed 5 or 10 acres, must be indicated on a site plan and approved by planning commission. Like that's a way to do it where it wouldn't be a CUP, but would give the planning commission the authority to weigh in on location of the sign. Because otherwise, all other signs are from face changes to like color changes, moving to electronic boards, are all administered just through the code. And then it's a sign permit through our building code.
And I was more meaning the off premise
Right.
signage
Mhm.
to have a separate process to
Yeah.
to go through that where everyone knows
This is a weird
we
one.
got to sort this one out. We've been
Right.
told no when we did our site plan approval.
Yeah, for sure. And that leading tech doesn't own that corner. They have, well, I don't know, we'll find out on Friday. I mean, it's the place where the sign should probably go for the most visibility for the city. And but America First, they own their own land, and they will build their building on their own land. And so that will never be part of Barker Depot as a whole, and same as Wells Fargo. And that's the reason that the Crossroads Plaza sign, where it used to be kind of next to Wells Fargo, when they had the drive-through, got plucked up out of the ground and moved to the east a little bit, was they moved it off of their property and we widened the road. So we knocked their sign down, widening the road, and then they put it back afterward. But that was all administrative.
Scott, did you say those lots have been sold?
They are in, well, I don't know exactly the fine, but they
Has-
are
has-
all owned individually. They're subdivided and owned.
So the subdivisions recorded?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you will see the preliminary plat in 2 weeks from today. For but Mountain America is recorded, O'Reilly is recorded, and you will see a preliminary plat for AFCU and 2 drive-through uses that will consume kind of the
Okay,
rest
so
of the
we'll
space.
be looking at that preliminary plat. Okay,
And site plan. We'll run them
Yes.
concurrently.
okay.
Okay, so the next step with this particular zone text amendment item is what?
So we will post formal public hearing on Friday, which will meet our 10-day requirement prior to the next meeting on the 19th. And then we're going to separate this into 2 lists or more, 2 or more lists. One, it'll either be all the really problematic items and all the easy items, but my guess is it'll be just all the easy items will be indicated as the city intends to change Title 11 in these ways, and we'll put all of them out there. And so people will know what sections are changing. And then we'll say, in addition to that, we'll post a public notice that says, we're going to change the animal and fowls section, and we're going to change the proximity and location of a swimming pool. Swimming pool is another one that has a proximity location that, is it on? I don't remember if it's on this list or not, but right now, a swimming pool can be no closer than 35 feet to a neighboring property owner's property. And this has happened a lot where the house and the swimming pool building permits come in concurrently to one another, or like right following each other. And then the neighbor's house comes in. And again, we have this, I've had this argument with Nate about, well, let's deny the house because it's closer than 35 feet to the pool, which we don't do. And then that neighbor ultimately wants a swimming pool, which can't comply either. And we let them build them because if we didn't, we would get,
Fair.
it would have a hailstorm rain down on us. So what we do is I write on the plans that the pool can be no closer than 35 feet to the neighboring property. And then we just never stick a tape measure between the two because you have an existing house. So it again became a who came first code. And someone at some point determined that 35 feet was the right decibel level of enjoyment of a swimming pool away from my house. That's how far away it had to be. And it's just, I don't know that it matters. And we have hundreds of swimming pools around the city that are currently not compliant, that we permitted, inspected, reviewed, and allowed to go in. So the swimming pool code's another one of those like who came first that needs to change or be considered.
So at the next meeting, we'll look at the easy items, but these other things like the chickens and the pools and
You'll
stuff, are
probably
we gonna do that at the next meeting as well?
Maybe we might kind of meter them out,
Okay,
but
yeah.
we'll put them on there because you could always,
We'll take those
have-
systematically.
yeah, you could always have a short item on it, but it depends on how contentious it is and how we think the public meeting process is, because we don't want to like squander the public comments piece about any of it. But we also don't want to spend several hours in here going over every one of these in depth. So it's kind of, we'll do our best to meter them out. Like if we realize that there's 5 or 6 really hard ones, maybe we'll do one per meeting as we go.
Yeah.
Is that acceptable?
Yeah,
Okay.
that sounds great.
I think the others will go really fast though, and we'll have real easy list and then,
Agree.
but the code is good. The new code is really good. It's easier to administer and it's about 100 pages shorter than the previous code. So we're, 2 ways to look at it. We're either 100 pages more efficient or 100 pages less safe. Because with the legislative session right now, we're like 900 new laws have been proposed that we're 900 new laws safer. We don't even know yet the number of passed laws, but feel good about it. That update will be coming to you in the probably first meeting of April. We'll give you a legislative update of how that has affected us municipally from a bunch of standpoints. And we'll let you know. Okay. I think that's I'm not looking for any motions or anything. Thank you very much for the work session on that. And when you're ready, Chair, I'd talk about the next item.
Yeah, I just want to take a little bit of a poll here and see this next section under administrative items number 6. This was sort of our open forum that we've kind of been asking for, but it's already 8 o'clock. And I don't know if you guys have anything that's on fire, or should we move that to more of a work session roundtable kind of thing for another night? I'm open to it if you guys want to take a break and come back to the table and have this open discussion. But if you want to sort of table it for another night, that.
Can I take just,
Yes, please.
could I take like 2 minutes and just show you?
Oh, sure.
I just want to show you kind of, and it was an idea and it might seed to you
Okay.
further ideas. So Commissioner Green had requested that we look at Fruitland Drive from how should this roadway be be built out? Right now it's this really neat kind of old historical road. And as you get up to Ward Farms, Ivory Home subdivision, you realize that it's just asphalt to a curb and gutter and a sidewalk that kind of is from nowhere to nowhere. So Eric Casperson, our city engineer, built 3 different cross sections for how we could attach bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure to Fruitland that would be non-traditional curb and gutter. And this will come back to you. You'll see this as a recommendation. It would then be put in as a public works standard for Fruitland as it's built out. But this is the perfect type of idea where NISA had asked, when do I engage as a planning commission member with staff on ideas that I have? And my answer was basically at any point. but we wanted to be responsive to the planning commission's recommendation of let's have work session type of items. So it's stuff like this would be wonderful to have you weigh in on in more consideration. And then our city engineer took that seriously, went back, has done some drawings. So we'll of course bring this idea full circle back to you. But be thinking about those things, and we'll leave space. We can do work sessions specifically. I know we have a busy meeting next meeting, so we'll see what the first meeting in April looks like, if we can save some, but I kind of
Do you have
figured,
some things tonight? Because we could just take a 5-minute break and come right back.
no, it was for you to talk to us about the
And
things that you
this
might be.
was my time sensitive pressing thing. So thank you, Scott, for bringing that up, was just to, I would be interested in maybe just hearing from you guys briefly, what your kind of appetite for something like this for Fruitland Drive would be, that new public works standard. So we don't have curb, gutter, sidewalk abutting, like some of the sections, preserving that historic kind of character of Fruitland.
I like this, the drawings, they're interesting.
Yeah, he's done, because one of the things when I tried to do some homework on this for them, just to give them, I mean, he's the expert, but what we were looking at was, yeah, how was it like a protected bike lane, street trees, but essentially coming up with a public work standard that could be carried throughout that road, giving us a nicer, just beautiful kind of country lane vibe, and preserving one of the few unique features of North Ogden City. So I love just the work, and I'd want to just state that. Thank you to Eric, for putting that work in. But this, and Scott, can you just really quick, what am I looking at
Yeah,
here
so
with,
that-
like, level 2 and 3?
Yeah, so the bottom one is Fruitland Drive as it exists today, which is
Okay, 'cause I don't have a big
is
text.
simply 24 feet of asphalt with no other improvement. So
Okay.
the road is crowned, so all stormwater is just kind of exiting into, at times swales, at times not really people's property, but it just naturally flows off. So the middle version is you would focus all bicycle and pedestrian as a 10-foot wide multi-use path on one side of the road that would be separated by a 1.5 foot wide by about 8-inch tall curb. So you'd put a physical barrier, so they would notice it. You know, the car would notice the curb before they, ran you over. But
The
the
bike
curb, that's curb separated. And then the top version, so think of that as like, that's the less expensive, that's the Hyundai. And then like the top is like the Cadillac. And so this would be, you have a park strip bioswale that's 8 feet wide, a minor rolled curb of 2 foot wide. So as we built sections of Fruitland, we'd probably re-crown the road. So all the water would be taken to one side and put into that bioswale. And then you have, at that point, 10 feet of separation between the traveling car and the bikes and peds are again in their own multi-use path. As you drive Fruitland, the next time you drive it, be thinking about that multi-use path exists in one of two places, and it's either cutting into the hillside or hanging off of the hillside. And so Fruitland as a whole has a side slope going across it. And the current kind of like light recommendation, and of course, all those property owners haven't been notified and we haven't purchased a bunch of right of way, but is to put the bike and ped path on the downhill side because it has far fewer effects on driveways than cutting one into the hillside. Because if you cut into the hillside and you flatten out Fruitland for another 10 feet, then all of those people's driveways get extremely steep, or the path sits and, does this to go up over all those driveways, which is one way or another of how, it's, what do you like or dislike more or less? But we authorize, NISA's request came in and we have now put a money request out to have the entirety of Fruitland surveyed. So we would have an understanding of where do we need to buy right of way, where don't we? What are the general elevations? Like we'll have a much better picture. So Eric threw this together as kind of like two options. And
How would we deal with the sections that already have curb and gutter?
that's a great question. Do we just leave them as existing, or do you put money in the budget to
Like,
tear
where
them
do
out
you
and fix
put
them?
the-
At
Yeah,
Ward Farms, for instance?
to put the bike path
Mhm.
in those situations.
Right. It's a good question.
Ward Farms and then also down by the church
Mhm.
and the park.
Yeah, in front of Barker Park.
Yeah.
So Barker Park has an existing sidewalk on the east side. So what would happen is the bike path would be on the west side. In the unincorporated area, we would widen to the west.
Surveyable.
Yeah, and the survey will show us where the right of way exists, because sometimes that asphalt hovers one way or another. Mountain Road is worse in the old cases than Fruitland, I think, or well, maybe not worse, but they both do this. But there are sections of Mountain Road that the asphalt as it sits is almost entirely like already touching right of way line on one side or the curb line, and the other side, it's like needs to expand significantly the other direction. So the road moves within the right of way.
Are there any plans at the S curve, let's say at
Yes.
2100?
Yeah, so the S curve, we've applied to Wasatch Front Regional Council for a roundabout at the S curve. And the roundabout would be fully accommodating with bike and ped facilities through it, regardless of what happens here. So even if we only build a few 100 feet on each leg of that roundabout, it will be a roundabout with a bike and ped facility through it. Similar to your most, and Eric Casperson, our city engineer, designed this one, but 1100 East and 900 South in Salt Lake, the roundabout that has the painted whale in it.
Oh.
So that's your visual marker, 9th and 9th, and then go up to the whale. And that has both a sidewalk and a shared use path. So they put the 9-line shared use path through that roundabout, but also there was an existing sidewalk. So there's kind of like several facilities, but that's an example of like a Dutch roundabout where you have the grade separated bike path that comes through each leg of the roundabout. And that's how it was conceived. So we'll see if WFRC, that we met on site with them, they make those funding decisions in spring. And unfortunately, those funds are 6 years out. If we get them, it's a significant money request through the Surface Transportation Program funds, but 6 years happens really quickly, actually, when you realize.
If this ends up not being financially feasible,
Mhm.
but we end up with some good design ideas, I think they should carry over to like the bottom section of Monroe.
Yeah.
You know, because there's a lot of space there, you know, it either, and that could create pedestrian access
Mhm.
into our commercial zone from
Yep.
residential areas, you know, thinking of active transportation since Brandon's not here.
Yep.
And I think another thought I had too is, you know, I know you and I know this very well, but 2700 North, there's severe sidewalk pedestrian safety issues. I know that there's plans in the, you know, long term to fix, but a model like this proposal would sure look good on 2700 North
Be incredible.
Yeah.
rather than having the traditional.
Yep, that'd be incredible.
Yeah, and it would connect right to Fruitland and create a nice pedestrian.
Yeah, that
Byway.
all that thought would be amazing, actually.
I feel like a few years ago, we've seen a sort of some options like this for Mountain Road, haven't we?
We did, and the end goal of I'm sorry.
All the way down, not just the
Yeah,
new section.
And the determination was a 6-foot wide trail on the east side, a standard trail on the west side, and no planted median. That's the public works standard that we got to.
For Mountain.
And for Mountain Road, and that's what we've been for the newest sections like Northview Phase 10, which is coming, that's what will be built. Mountain Road has a variety of different designs. There's areas with regular curb, but there are areas that have the trail. And if it's not in the public works standard, then the public works standard is just build the normal road, right? So we really need to get a drawing and in, so as we have developments happen adjacent to it, we pick up the right facility from them at the time.
That Cadillac standard on as many roads as possible in North Ogden would be absolutely awesome.
And then, you know, if we can't geographically have the Cadillac standard, move to a Hyundai and back to a Cadillac.
Yeah, there's and the survey will give us, yep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
You know,
But you know, there's only so much
yeah.
to work with, right?
Right.
And then there's a little section where it's
Yeah.
breathing space.
Yep.
Yeah, you'll see this again. It'll come back, but I just
didn't mean
wanted,
to rush people.
No.
I thought it was more like the open forum we had been at, but
Yeah.
I think this is a great topic and I'm I'm okay to spend more time on it if you need something from us.
Yeah,
tonight.
do you need anything from us at this point? And again, that's awesome. Eric came up with this and
It's great.
and again, my motivation was we do a lot of reactive planning, which makes sense. But
Mhm.
if we continue in that mode, then when the development comes in, we're going to get the
Yep.
the
Right,
basic. I
right.
guess if the middle's
Yeah.
what did you call it? What's the bottom level? I guess I shouldn't say.
I
bottom.
don't know. I mean,
The
it's just
point is,
Yugo.
yeah, you're gonna get the
You know,
Yugos.
current, better, best or something. And it might not even be best. Like bioswales can be problematic. Maybe just a curb separated facility works great.
Right.
And it will ebb and flow. It won't be 100% perfect design. Like the better way to think of it is if we had on Fruitland a safe multi-use path that connected Mountain Road all the way down to 2600 and it were grade separated in some fashion, whether, you know, it did this, that would be the win for the city and for the users and for everybody, just to improve that safety.
And you start with the dream, right? And then you dial it back down to where it can be. But if we don't start up here, we won't end in the middle.
Yep.
But yeah, so do you need, it sounds like you don't need anything from us at this point in time.
I don't think so. It just for you to use, I was wanting to use this as an example of an idea that's come out. And if you have similar ideas, and it can be in lots of spaces like code, general plan, which we'll be bringing general plan amendment stuff to you soon this year. But just be thinking about those touch points as a planning commission member, as a resident. What are you hearing from neighbors? Like, what would you love to ask us to explore? And that's appropriate at any time, at any meeting. You can call, email us. But I thought the idea of giving you a forum or a time was great. And especially in the future in meetings that we would have maybe canceled a meeting, those would be great work session meetings. So we'll keep this on the radar for you to be thinking about.
I did bring a list. You probably did too.
Mhm.
So if you guys want to continue with a work session tonight, we could.
Or at our
I was
next
just throwing it out.
canceled meeting, is that kind of what you're thinking? Like instead of a canceled meeting, we would for sure have a work session instead.
Or you could, you can email the items to us too. And then again, we can kind of like meter them out or help think about them that way.
You know, the reality is this is as we get into the summer months, we're gonna have more and more people, harder and harder to, you know, we're gonna have less meetings where we have the full commission here. That's generally how, in my experience, how it works in the summertime. And so sometimes they have to cancel meetings because of, you know, I don't know, that's just my experience and that's probably yours too. So the later we get towards the summer, I think the, you know, our opportunities for everybody to have some input is less. So
But I mean-
I'm okay with proceeding if you guys want to. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts tonight.
I think we ought to try and wrap a time frame around these work sessions,
Yeah.
you know, so
Yeah.
we go into it like, hey,
Fresh.
it's gonna be a 2 hour meeting
Right.
or it's gonna be a 2.5 hour meeting. What's
Right.
our effectiveness at 2.5 hours?
You
And
know,
and
Yeah,
I'm not saying,
no, I'm.
you know, and we put some breaks in that agenda
Yeah.
and we sort of
Exactly.
look at that.
Yeah.
That's a good suggestion. Especially, you know, to keep staff here till
That's what I'm.
1 in the
concerned about.
morning. Talking about, I'm all for this.
Yeah.
But, so, but I think that if we had a plan and we're like, hey, our 2.5 hours is our hard stop.
Right.
Then there's not a question of like, do we bring up this next one or
Yes.
do we bring up this
Mhm.
next one? So that's my 2 cents.
I think I would like to have like an initial session just to kind of brainstorm with staff of what are our boundaries? What, you know, let's throw a few things out there. What can we, you know, what can we really make an impact in? Like, this was a great, perfect example. But, you know, I know, like Scott, you've talked before about, I'm not sure I understood it all at the time, but, you know, you've talked about like some cities have, you know, looked at properties, say in the commercial corridor, and you've used the term like upzone. I'm not sure I understand that, but it was somehow like, you know, you designate a zone now for what the vision is going to be, and then it puts, if it's sort of like higher than what it is now, it puts the city in a good position to negotiate up or down with you know, a developer, a commercial entity
Yeah.
or something like that. You know, I guess I would like to be more educated in if we can apply something like that to, say, Washington Boulevard properties and
Yeah.
that haven't been But I think there's some things that are out of bounds of what we could really do, but I don't know that,
We could put, I think that's a good training
Mhm.
idea, if Ryan will write it down, is the effects of like upzoning to entice redevelopment.
Mhm.
Because there are some areas, and we've heard R4 maxes out at 15 dwelling units per acre. Village at Prominence Point, on the whole, on the average, is like 18 and a half. It's not much higher than that 15, but it was permitted through the MPC code
Mhm.
at a little higher density.
Yeah.
And what's the right number? And we have some existing residential areas along Washington that are of lower, not value, I don't know. They're not maintained as well, but they're not that, but they are worth so much that to buy them and tear them down and put 15 dwelling units an acre, we have been told by multiple developers, there's not enough units. I don't have enough doors there to make my money back. And I'm not saying that we need to enrich developers, but if we do want to entice redevelopment of certain areas of the city, then therein comes the exchange, right? Like we will have to be considering more than 15 units an acre. And I don't know what the correct number is for us. Like we're not Ogden and Salt Lake. We don't need to be thinking 110 units per acre,
Yeah.
but is it 20 or is it 25? And what planning commission could help the city council with, because you'd be making a recommendation, is we're willing to upzone, or we're willing to consider areas where we would increase the base density by a certain number of doors, but this is the exchange that we want. And what is that proper exchange? Because you could codify that actually like as an upzone process, and maybe the exchange is really, really good streetscape amenities. Maybe it's exchange of cash that goes into a fund that buys park space in areas of the city where we're under open spaced. So there's lots of potential there. But I think that for you, and this is kind of hard as a planning commission member because you all have full-time jobs and families and other things to think about, but so maybe we can come up with and give you some examples of what does 20, well, except Lauren's got all the time in the world now. But what does 20 or 25 units per acre look like on the ground in different configurations? Because it can be surprisingly similar looking to what we would permit today, depending on how those boxes hit the ground. And Brandon Bell tried this 7-8 years ago, I'm guessing, tried to do the form-based code thing. And it failed. But form-based code, you eliminate all references to the total dwelling units, the numbers, even sometimes the uses, like you really don't care. It's just, I want Washington Boulevard from this point to this point to have this look to it.
Yeah.
And then we don't care whether you're selling hot tubs out of it or it's a first floor apartment. Like we really don't care. We're just
Yeah.
building to a physical building box area. So form-based code is another way to get that done, but that's
Well,
something for the planning
maybe
commission to
that
consider.
could be like the topic of our like work session and in reference to the comment about like efficiency. So maybe like we know that's the agenda item coming into another work session as we explore that more.
Like take off chunks of it and not try to.
So we start with this
keep
upzoning
it
kind
to
of
2.5
missing
hours.
middle
Yes.
conversation and
Yeah.
we start that next time.
Yeah.
Does that sound?
And I think one question is I would just look, all of our discussions about, economic development and Washington Boulevard, there are places we've discussed, like say, for instance, Washington Boulevard between 1700 and 1500. On the west side, there's, I don't know if it's agriculture, residential, but there's some homes there, right?
It's
But-
unincorporated,
Well,
except for a small portion of.
I know, but in our plan,
Yeah,
I guess.
it's multifamily.
Behind there.
Yep.
I feel like, there's some fields back there that, we've looked at townhouse developments and
Yeah.
things like that. And we've had the discussion like, as we move forward to Washington Boulevard in these pockets, and even though that's unincorporated now, there's some other ones just like that further north
Mhm.
on Washington Boulevard, where maybe there's a single family home or maybe even a partially agricultural property.
Right.
But in our general plan, maybe, we're looking at that to be some kind of commercial or mixed use sort of property in the future. We want some commercial along there. But in the past, we've never looked at a property without a developer coming in and saying, this should be this zone.
Right.
This should be a commercial zone because that's what we want it to be in the future.
Mhm.
Because right now it's a residential zone. But could we be proactive and actually request to change the zone of something without an external developer coming in to ask for that change? Could we be proactive in zoning it for what we want it to be in the future?
Yep, you can, and you could align, we could slowly or quickly, but over time, look at aligning the on-the-ground zoning with the general plan. And that is a way to, it kind of vests the general plan,
Yeah.
or it gives assurance to developers that this is going to happen. The downside or the impact and effect of that is that multifamily residential zoning being applied to single-family zoning can have impacts on property tax values in a detrimental way to the underlying property.
Yeah, and which we don't want that.
Right. Or the other thing is we can put any zone anywhere we want in the city technically, but you can create a lot of non-conforming uses, which used to be called grandfathered. It's legal non-conforming. And that's things like old agricultural areas that still have animals on them now because they're in an A1, some old ag zone. But we know that long-term we want a multifamily. By applying the zone today, you immediately disallow them from expanding the use, and they must then keep it in perpetuity for fear of losing it. If they take it away for more than 1 year, it strips them of that essential property right. So there's things to think about that way. What we could do is reopen the general plan land use map and get really, really specific on what you ultimately want. And that would be a safe place to do it because it's still at the request of a developer to come in, but you could say, we've already had these hard conversations, so we know just what we want. You now, you align your.
So when another,
Yes.
high density
Yeah.
apartment complex comes in and wants to put another one of those units there,
You just recommend no because we've
already had
commercial.
this sort of future planning.
Yeah.
That is what is my highest topic in what I've been referencing is
Yeah.
because it's quickly going to disappear on Washington Boulevard, and we're not going to have that opportunity to ever change it
Mhm.
and bring those new, I don't know, this.
A
economic development
residential's
over.
about 100-year commitment is what on average.
Yeah,
Single family homes being the longest, and then commercial, depending on the size of the big box, like Harrisville's Walmart is really hanging on. I mean, that's like
Mm.
right at the tail end of the average lifespan of a single user in like 100,000 square foot building. Those have more like somewhere between like a 15 and a 25-year turnaround time. Layton City, like I'm old enough now to have seen the Layton Walmart be constructed and then torn down and made into the parking lot for the new Layton Walmart off of Hillfield Road and Main Street in Layton. So the timing, I mean, 5 Points as you drive around that, like that was Wang's Guards and now it's torn down, right? So the lifespan of those buildings is a lot lesser. Commercial turns over a lot faster than residential. So your residential decisions, we really need to think about those because once that hits the ground, it's highly unlikely it's changing in anybody's
Yeah.
lifetime.
so maybe we could look at just a few of these topics at the next
Yeah, that'd be great.
open discussion,
Sure.
even if we fit it into another.
And if you want to email them to me, then we can do like a short staff memo and you can see it and you and I, we can have a conversation about it. This is what I want to talk about. And then you're prepared as opposed to this was just really meant to
Like-
be like a 30-minute open
brainstorm,
forum.
right.
Yeah, but I realize it's late and we just went through a lot of code.
We know you guys have been here all day, so, okay.
it's- well,
Everybody
I'm
okay
salary.
with that?
it all pays the same.
All right, so, I'm not gonna ask for public comments unless somebody's online.
Nope.
What?
All right.
I don't think anyone, I
Planning
don't think
Commission,
anyone's
any
jumped on.
other remarks? Okay. Scott, Community and Economic Development
Just
Director.
Just the question of inadvertently, last Friday was the closure of the APA conference's early registration fee, so we will pay a few dollars extra. Lauren has indicated that he'd like to attend the entire conference. I will check on our budget that we have left and whether or not we can afford to hotel room you, but being that it's in Logan, you're probably driving every day. You will receive mileage and a food per diem for those days of the conference, so we'll fill that out as staff. Mileage in-state in your own vehicle, if there's not a city vehicle allowed, it's only 50% of the government mileage rate, but still you'd be getting paid something like 30 cents a mile to drive up there and back each time. If we have a city vehicle permitted and what I can drive us in like the Chevy Traverse and I take us all up there, you won't get the mileage, but you'll get to ride with one of us. So that's, that's how you're paid. But tonight we'd like to register this week or early next week for the conference. So can anybody indicate, and do you have the dates available?
May 7th, which is a Wednesday, to May 9th, that Friday. Wednesday is half a day. It starts at around 1. And then it'll end at 12 on Friday. So Thursday's a full day.
I'm tentative for Friday. I needed to look at the agenda. I wanted to see like what was happening and I could potentially do Friday. I'd like to, but I will confirm with you soon.
And if you can't commit tonight, will you just send us an email so that we get you registered?
Perfect.
Thank
Uh,
you.
Sorry, Jeff.
That's it. No, thank you.
John, city manager, attorney report?
No, I know that what we've been trying to do, I say no and then I talk. But this type of conversation has kind of been the goal for the planning commission, is to move into that long-term planning role, offload the administrative stuff to the staff that's lower level and not political. And so this is right in line with what we're thinking. And I do appreciate the comment tonight about, hey, so maybe we'll just set time limits and say, we're going to talk about this for 35 minutes and then move on to the next thing. So.
New idea each time or something.
Yeah.
Like it. What was my idea? Of course I like it.
We've got good ideas.
A motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you all
the
for
input
hanging on
tonight.
here.